Good morning. Thank you for joining me today. This morning we'll be in 2 Samuel chapter 15, verse 23, through chapter 16, verse 23. And this continues from Absalom seizing the crown and expelling his father David from the land. All the land was weeping loudly, as all these people were leaving. As the king was crossing over the Kidron Valley, all the people were leaving on the road that leads to the desert. Zadok and all the Levites who were with him were carrying the Ark of the Covenant of God. When they positioned the Ark of God, Abiathar offered sacrifices until all the people had finished leaving the city. Then the king said to Zadok, "Take the Ark of God back to the city. If I find favor in the Lord's sight, he will bring me back and enable me to see both it and its dwelling place again. However, if he should say, 'I do not take pleasure in you,' then he will deal with me in a way that he considers appropriate." The king said to Zadok the priest, "Are you a seer? Go back to the city in peace. Your son Ahimaaz and Abiathar's son Jonathan may go with you, and Abiathar. Look, I will be waiting at the fords of the desert until word from you reaches me." So Zadok and Abiathar took the Ark of God back to Jerusalem and remained there. As David was going up to the Mount of Olives, he was weeping as he went. His head was covered, and his feet were bare. All the people who were with him also had their heads covered and were weeping as they went up. Now David had been told, "Ahithophel has sided with the conspirators who are with Absalom." So David prayed, "Make the advice of Ahithophel foolish, O Lord." When David reached the summit where he used to worship God, Hushai the Archite met him with his clothes torn and dirt on his head. David said to him, "If you leave with me, you will be a burden to me. But you will be able to counter the advice of Ahithophel if you go back to the city and say to Absalom, 'I will be your servant, O king. Previously I was your father's servant, and now I will be your servant.' Zadok and Abiathar the priests will be there with you. Everything you hear in the king's palace, you must tell Zadok and Abiathar the priests. Furthermore, their 2 sons are there with them, Zadok's son Ahimaaz and Abiathar's son Jonathan. You must send them to me with any information you hear." So David's friend Hushai arrived in the city, just as Absalom was entering Jerusalem. When David had gone a short way beyond the summit, Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, was there to meet him. He had a couple of donkeys that were saddled, and on them were 200 loaves of bread, 100 raisin cakes, 100 baskets of summer fruit, and a container of wine. The king asked Ziba, "Why did you bring these things?" Ziba replied, "The donkeys are for the king's family to ride on. The loaves of bread and the summer fruit are for the attendants to eat, and the wine is for those who get exhausted in the desert." The king asked, "Where is your master's grandson?" Ziba replied to the king, "He remains in Jerusalem, for he said, 'Today the house of Israel will give back to me my grandfather's kingdom.'" The king said to Ziba, "Everything that was Mephibosheth's now belongs to you." Ziba replied, "I bow before you. May I find favor in your sight, my lord the king." Then King David reached Bahurim. There a man from Saul's extended family, named Shimei, son of Gera, came out yelling curses as he approached. He threw stones at David and all of King David's servants, as well as all the people and the soldiers who were on his right and on his left. As he yelled curses, Shimei said, "Leave, leave, you man of bloodshed, you wicked man. The Lord has punished you for all the spilled blood of the house of Saul, in whose place you rule. Now the Lord has given the kingdom into the hand of your son Absalom. Disaster has overtaken you, for you are a man of bloodshed." Then Abishai, son of Zeruiah, said to the king, "Why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over and cut off his head." But the king said, "What do we have in common, you sons of Zeruiah? If he curses because the Lord has said to him, 'Curse David,' who can say to him, 'Why have you done this?'" Then David said to Abishai and all his servants, "My own son, my very own flesh and blood, is trying to take my life. So also now this Benjaminite. Leave him alone so that he can curse, for the Lord has spoken to him. Perhaps the Lord will notice my affliction, and this day grant me good in place of his curse. So David and his men went on their way, but Shimei kept going along the side of the hill opposite him, yelling curses as he threw stones and dirt at them. The king and all the people who were with him arrived exhausted at their destination, where David refreshed himself. Now, when Absalom and all the men of Israel arrived in Jerusalem, Ahithophel was with him. When David's friend Hushai the Archite came to Absalom, Hushai said to him, "Long live the king! Long live the king!" Absalom said to Hushai, "Do you call this loyalty to your friend? Why didn't you go with your friend?" Hushai replied to Absalom, "No, I will be loyal to the one whom the Lord, these people, and all the men of Israel have chosen. Moreover, whom should I serve? Should it not be his son? Just as I served your father, so I will serve you." Then Absalom said to Ahithophel, "Give us your advice. What should we do?" Ahithophel replied to Absalom, "Have sex with your father's concubines, whom he left to care for the palace. All Israel will hear that you have made yourself repulsive to your father. Then your followers will be motivated to support you." So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and Absalom had sex with his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. In those days, Ahithophel's advice was considered as valuable as a prophetic revelation. Both David and Absalom highly regarded the advice of Ahithophel. So there you go. Rough time for David as he's leaving the city here and trying to get away from his son Absalom. The previously mentioned sins that David failed to address and indeed committed in the case of Bathsheba and Uriah have come back to bite him in full force. But David isn't without supporters here as he leaves the city. Zadok and all the Levites, Zadok is the priest, want to go with him, and they want to take the Ark of the Lord with them. But Zadok is commanded by David essentially to remain in the city, and whatever happens, he can send his sons to inform David on what happens. That is, to be spies, essentially. And he also sends back Hushai, the Archite, who was his close friend and advisor, and tells him to go and serve the king. That is Absalom now. And to inform on him, to act as a double agent. Yeah. And then you have Ziba, who David left in charge of Mephibosheth's stuff, essentially. Since Mephibosheth was lame, he appointed who used to be Saul's servant to work on Mephibosheth's stuff. And Mephibosheth was supposed to have a place at the king's table, but I doubt he could come with David, seeing as he was lame. But Ziba here accuses Mephibosheth of treason. That is, today the house of Israel will give back to me my grandfather's kingdom. Ziba here is accusing him of wanting to seize the throne again, and not caring about all the good that David did for him, but rather trying to seize the throne again. And this later, of course, turns out to be false, and Ziba is just taking all of Mephibosheth's stuff and leaving. And the king, not knowing any better, says to Ziba, "Everything that was Mephibosheth's now belongs to you." And yeah. Then you have this instance where this, grandson of Saul, or what was it? A man from Saul's extended family, rather, named Shimei, son of Gera, came out and was cursing David and saying essentially, "You got what was coming to you," and tossing stones and dirt at David and the whole royal company. And Abishai wants to go over and kill him, but David says, if the Lord said to him to curse David, then it would be really bad for somebody to go over there and kill him, essentially, because he's just doing what the Lord told him to do. And David puts his trust in the mercy of the Lord, saying, "Perhaps the Lord will notice my affliction, and this day grant me good in place of his curse." And then, of course, you have Absalom entering Jerusalem and accepting Hushai into his council, and Ahithophel, who had really betrayed David and who was a very trusted advisor, so much so that Ahithophel's words were basically like receiving revelation from God himself. And Ahithophel advises Absalom to take his father's concubines that he had left in charge of the royal palace and to go have sex with them on top of the roof in full view of everybody, so as to demonstrate to all of Israel that he has made himself odious to his father. So yeah, pretty disgusting. Let's see what Guzik has to say here. Where did we start? 1523. Zadok also and all the Levites with him, bearing the Ark of the Covenants of God. The priests were loyal to David, even though it probably meant death for them if Absalom succeeded. It was good that the men, who should be spiritually sensitive to Absalom's evil and David's good, were indeed sensitive to it. Carry the Ark of God back into the city. David trusted in God, not in the Ark of the Covenant. He was willing to let the Ark go back to Jerusalem and to put his fate in God's hands. It's interesting. Previous to this, in the times of Samuel, you had the Israelites indeed putting faith in the Ark of God rather than in God himself, saying that if they just brought the Ark of God with them into a battle with the Philistines, then they would succeed in battle, regardless of how they were acting and regardless of their relationship with the God whose Ark it is. But rather, David brightly recognized its place and said that the Ark can go back to Israel. God will still go with me. If I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he will bring me back. If he says thus, I have no delight in you, here I am. Let him do to me as seems good to him. David's humble and chastened spirit proved he knew God, dealt with him righteously. David submitted to God with an active submission, not a passive one. Are you not a seer? David recognized that Zadok was a prophet, a man of supernatural insight, might be a valuable information source for David. And thus he advised him to return to the city and to have his two sons as informants. David went up the ascent of the Mount of Olives. When Jesus went from the Last Supper to the Garden of Gethsemane to pray, he essentially traced these same steps of David. Both David and Jesus suffered for sin, but Jesus suffered for our sins, and David suffered for his own. And he wept as he went up, and he had his head covered and went barefoot. These were emblems of mourning. David was struck by the greatness of this tragedy for the nation, for his family, and for himself. This wasn't a pity party, or soreness merely over the consequences of his sin. He is crushed by the consciousness that his punishment is deserved. The bitter fruit of the sin that filled all his lighter life with darkness. His courage and his buoyancy have left him. From McLaren. In light of all the facts, it is almost certain that the tears of David shed, as he climbed Olivet, were rather those of humiliation and penitence than those of self-centered regret. For Absalom there was no excuse, but David carried in his own heart ceaselessly the sense of his own past sin. For Morgan. This shows David was a redeemed man. Some would say that God let David off easy, that he deserved the death penalty for adultery and murder. If God forgave him and spared David that penalty, surely David would just do it again. Those who think this way do not understand how grace and forgiveness work in the heart of the redeemed. David's sin was ever before him, and in a strange combination of deep gratitude and horror over his forgiven sin, David never did it again. Turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. David knew that Ahithophel was normally a good advisor, but he prayed that he would give foolish counsel to Absalom. This was done accordingly. Great is the power of faithful prayer. The Queen Mother of Scotland was heard to say that she more feared the prayers of John Knox than an army of fighting men. From Trapp. David had come to the top of the mountain where he worshipped God. David's life was in danger and he had to flee. Yet he took time to stop at the top of the Mount of Olives, look back upon Jerusalem and the tabernacle, and he worshipped God. David knew worship was always important, and he could worship when circumstances were bad. Then you may defeat the counsel of Ahithophel for me. David sent his other aide, Hushai, back to Jerusalem to frustrate Ahithophel's counsel to Absalom. Absalom came into Jerusalem. Absalom came into Jerusalem as a cunning, wicked rebel. David came into Jerusalem as a brave, noble conqueror. Jesus came into Jerusalem as a servant king. Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth. This Ziba was the servant of Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, to whom David showed great kindness, who met him with a couple of saddled donkeys. At a time of great need, Ziba met David with essential supplies. This was a generous and helpful gift from Ziba. He is in Jerusalem. Ziba told David that Mephibosheth was in Jerusalem, waiting to come to power after David and Absalom ruined each other. Ziba told David that Mephibosheth longed to restore the family of Saul to power. That is, today the house of Israel will restore the kingdom of my father to me. These were lies that Ziba told David, and this will be revealed in 2 Samuel 19:24-30. Actually, Ziba left Mephibosheth behind to make it look as if Mephibosheth did not support David. This report from Ziba hurt David, because in this time of crisis, the last thing he needed to hear was that another friend had turned against him. Ziba was utterly despicable, and the more so because at the moment the sorrow he brought to the heart of David was his feeling that his kindness toward Mephibosheth was ill-requited. From Morgan. Yeah. This was a shameless and senseless slander, uttered by a false and faithless sycophant. From Trapp. All that belongs to Mephibosheth is yours. David, acting on the only information he had, assumed that Ziba told the truth. Therefore, he rewarded Ziba's loyalty and punished Mephibosheth's reported disloyalty. This was exactly the response Ziba wanted. Ziba was an example of someone who wickedly used a crisis for his own benefit. A man from the family of the house of Saul. Shimei was a distant relative of the former king Saul, and he still resented David for replacing the dynasty of Saul. Cursing continuously, he threw stones. "You bloodthirsty man, you rogue!" Shimei was about as offensive as a person could be. He wanted to destroy any shred of dignity or confidence that David had left. There are always people ready to rejoice when a leader falls. Shimei had this heart against David for a long time, but he could only show it when David was down and out. It is very hard to bear a cowardly attack. One is very apt to reply and use hard words to one who takes advantage of your position and deals you the coward's blow. Only the coward strikes a man when he is down. From Spurgeon. The Lord has brought upon you all the blood of the house of Saul. You are caught in your own evil. A quick look at the outward appearance of things seemed to confirm Shimei's analysis. But Shimei was wrong. None of this came upon David because of what he did to Saul or Saul's family. Shimei was wrong because David actually treated Saul and his family with great love and graciousness. Shimei was wrong because David was not a bloodthirsty man. It is true that he was a man of war, but not a bloodthirsty man. Shimei was wrong because David did not bring Saul and his family to ruin. Saul himself brought the family to ruin. Shimei was right that the Lord had brought this upon David, but not for any of the reasons Shimei thought. It's interesting, though, too, that the same paranoid line of reasoning that Saul employed is echoed a bit here in Shimei, where you have Saul who was saying that David is constantly on the lookout to seize the throne and take it from him, and Saul seeking to ruin David because of it. And this, despite that not being true at all. And you have Shimei kind of echoing that same sort of reasoning here. That is that he didn't deal graciously with Saul and have his good in mind, but rather dealt unjustly with him. Abishai says, "Let me go over and take off his head." Abishai didn't want to listen to Shimei curse or dodge his stones anymore. The mighty men surrounding David were more than ready to kill Shimei in an instant. So let him curse. David didn't try to shut up Shimei. He didn't close his ears to unpleasant or critical words. David was willing to hear what God might say to him through a cursing critic. David let Shimei speak because he was not a bloodthirsty man. What have I to do with you? Ironically, if David were the kind of man Shimei said he was, Shimei would be dead. David let Shimei speak because he saw the hand of God in every circumstance. The Lord has said to him. He knew that God was more than able to shut Shimei up. David didn't need to give the order. David let Shimei speak because he put the Shimei problem in perspective. See how my son, who came from my own body, seeks my life. How much more now may this Benjaminite? David knew his real problem was Absalom, not Shimei, and he did not lose this perspective. David let Shimei speak because he knew that God's hand was on the future as well as the present. It may be that the Lord will look on my affliction, and that the Lord will repay me with good for his cursing this day. David knew that if he did what was right in the present moment, God would take care of the future. Let him alone, and let him curse. David could take this fellow's head off, that in a moment. And yet, he said, let him alone, let him curse. And this makes a splendid example. If you can revenge yourself, don't. If you could do it as easily as open your hand, keep it shut. If one bitter word could end the argument, ask for grace to spare that bitter word. From Spurgeon. So they refreshed themselves there. David was not without hope or comfort. God allowed comfort to find him, even if it was in the small things. David was able to receive the comfort because he was at peace, and he knew that God was in control of Israel. In refusing to cling to the throne, David was like Jesus, who, being in the form of God, did not consider it robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, taking the form of a bondservant, and coming in the likeness of men. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself, and became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross. As we thus follow David through these days of humiliation and shame, we nevertheless understand more perfectly that he was indeed a man after God's own heart. From Morgan. Yeah. And it's striking to me, kind of these similarities of David proceeding tearfully up to the Mount of Olives, of the shame and mockery of David as he goes along type thing. Certainly, in some ways, not all, David is a picture of the coming Messiah. In his book, A Tale of Three Kings, Gene Edwards put these words into the mouth of David. The throne is not mine, not to have, not to take, not to protect, and not to keep. The throne is the Lord's. It was that kind of heart that kept David on track through such a difficult time and enabled him to even be refreshed. This is radiant illustration of the deep and inward peace given to any man who is living in fellowship with God in motive and desire. From Morgan. When Hushai the Archite, David's friend, came to Absalom, Hushai wanted to leave with David and support him. David thought it was better to send Hushai back to Absalom, to both spy on Absalom and give him bad advice. The bad advice from Hushai was thought necessary because Ahithophel was with Absalom. Ahithophel was famous for his wise counsel, and David wanted someone on the inside of Absalom's leadership who might frustrate Ahithophel's counsel. As I have served in your father's presence, so will I be in your presence. Hushai lied to Absalom, concealing his motives, like any good spy hides his or her true intentions. Ahithophel said to Absalom, "Go into your father's concubines." Ahithophel told Absalom to do something so offensive that it would eliminate any possibility of reconciliation with David. Ahithophel felt this strong statement would give courage to Absalom's followers. In the ancient world, taking the king's concubines was not only an act of immorality, but also an act of treason. This was a way for Absalom to not only replace David, but also to completely repudiate his father. Why did Ahithophel give such radical advice? Because it made sense from his own self-interest. Ahithophel had the most to lose if Absalom failed to keep the throne, or if David and Absalom reconciled. He would be revealed and rejected as a traitor. The Puritan commentator John Trapp wrote this of Ahithophel's tongue, which gave this wicked advice. O tongue, worthy to have been cut out, shred in gobbets, and driven down the throat of him that thus misused it. To the engaging of Absalom in such an unpardonable villainy, beside hazard of his immortal soul. Yeah, it certainly isn't godly advice. So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the top of the house, and Absalom went into his father's concubines. This disgraceful act said a lot about Absalom, who actually did it. It also said a lot about Ahithophel, who must have had a strange sense of satisfaction in seeing David's women violated in a similar way to how his granddaughter Bathsheba was violated. 2 Samuel 11:3 tells us that Bathsheba's father was Eliam, one of David's mighty men. This also means that her grandfather was Ahithophel. This shows the power of bitterness. Ahithophel was willing to see these women abused. Absalom grievously sinned, and the kingdom of Israel suffer greatly, all simply to satisfy his bitter longing for revenge. This disgraceful incident also shows that God kept his promise to David. I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of the sun. For you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel, before the sun. In 2 Samuel 12. Every part of the conduct of Absalom shows him to have been a most profligate young man. He was proud, vindictive, adulterous, incestuous, a parasite, and, in fine, reprobate to every good word and work. From Clark. Now the advice of Ahithophel, which he gave in those days, was as if one had inquired at the oracle of God. Ahithophel had a well-deserved reputation for giving counsel almost as good as God, but in this case his counsel was foolish and destructive. It was foolish and destructive because it was motivated by bitterness. Bitterness has the power to turn our best qualities sour. It was foolish and destructive because God answered David's prayer by prompting Ahithophel to give this foolish counsel, and in prompting Absalom to take the foolish counsel. Strangely, Absalom thought he could establish his kingdom through immorality. He was a clever and skilled politician, but ignorant about the ways of God. Yeah. Difficult couple of chapters. But I think, to me, it demonstrates most clearly that God says, "Vengeance is mine, and I shall repay, not you." David exhibited this well. He took his punishment well, recognizing that it was what he deserved. He didn't grovel in self-centered pity, but rather in humble repentance before God. And indeed, David will be later refreshed by God. So I think even if we are going through difficult times, even if we ultimately deserve those times, we need to trust in God that ultimately He'll do what's right. And if we lean on Him, we won't be disappointed. Anyhow, thank you so much for joining me today. Hope you have a great day. Bye.